Okay, it's time to start the last of the PyCon JP 2015 talks. So please start the presentation.
Justin Meyer と申します。よろしくお願いします。今回は英語で発表させていただくんですが、もし終わった後何か質問かコメントがあればぜひどうぞ。Yeah, a little bit. I hope that's okay. So I am Justin Meyer. I am the primary maintainer of a static site generator called Pelican. I also work on a couple other projects. One is called Monitorial, which is a server security monitoring tool. It's a software as a service tool. And Uprise, which is a coming project for buying concert tickets. So you might recognize this site. This is the Linux kernel archives. And one of the things that they recently did was they switched to a static site generator. And not too surprisingly, they switched to Pelican. This is Debian's site, where they have some news about Debian. This is a couple of different Linux user groups. And the question is why? Why are these sites choosing static site generators? Before I can answer that question, I want to first talk a little bit about the birth of the web. It was a much simpler time. It looks a little bit like this. Some of you may remember. And it was static. If you wanted to publish something, you wrote your HTML by hand. You had all of your content mixed in with your HTML tags. It was not very dry. Dry meaning do not repeat yourself. And when you wrote HTML, you repeated yourself all the time. You had a header. If you wanted to change something in the header or in the footer across all 25 of your pages, you changed it in 25 places. And it was, and the other thing is it was only for technical people. You either understood the gibberish of HTML or you did not. This was problematic. And so the solution to those problems was the CMS, where you have your content stored in a database. You have a web-based editor, so you don't have to be a programmer or a technical person. You can log in, and the server on each request will dynamically generate the page and serve it to the browser. But features are not free, and these advantages of the CMS came with some costs. And one of those is deployment. You started out with just a web server. Apache, usually back in those days. And now, once you add a CMS, you have to deploy an application server, whether it's Python or Django or Rails or PHP, whatever it is. There's the logic of the application, and then you have your database server. You have to learn how to install those things. And then it's not just a one-time deployment. You have maintenance as well. You have to upgrade your application server and upgrade your database server at some point. Content versioning becomes more difficult. And migration is also kind of hard. If you want to move from this installation to another server, you have to dump your database, recreate all of your application files, and then try to recreate it and hope that it works in your new system. Another problem is what I call the stampeding herd. So if you have a high-profile site, you work really hard, you write an article, and say, Nikkei BP links to your site. Congratulations, your site is popular, and your server just caught fire and died because it was trying to generate all of those requests, and it just could not keep up with it. And now your very hard work is not being viewed by anyone because your server is not responding. Another issue is security. There's a gentleman who wrote this article. If you have a chance to read it, it's very good. And he makes the argument that dynamic systems are just less secure by design than a non-dynamic system. And he refers to it as having a kick me sign on your site. It's an invitation. A content management system treats content as instructions. So in some ways, you can have people craft an attack by somehow getting a blog post or comment submitted to your site. The attack instructions are in that content. The server executes that, and now you have problems. Another one would be distributed denial of service attacks. Much easier to coordinate that kind of attack when your server has to generate the page dynamically every time. You also have a loss of simplicity. It's no longer just files. The Unix philosophy is everything's just files everywhere. And this is no longer the case when you are dealing with databases and other things like that. So you have the old way, and then there's the new way. And static site generators fall somewhere in between. It's maybe the sweet spot between the old static way and the new dynamic CMS. But this is not really a new idea. People think of static site generators as new, but they're not. If you have been around long enough, you may remember a project called Movable Type. This was popular before WordPress. And WordPress in some ways became popular because of Movable Type's poor business decisions, but that's a whole nother talk. So what is a static site generator? Your content is files. It's not just rows in a database. You have templates and content blocks, which is different than the old way of doing things. So you can still have all of the benefits of making a change in one place and having that change replicated across all of your different pages. You generate locally, and then you sync that your static assets to the server. And everything is static and it's self-contained. The formats that you compose your content in can be one of a variety of formats. Markdown is probably the most popular. Restructured text in the Python world is also popular. It's certainly more powerful than Markdown. Some would argue at the expense of some readability, but it depends on what it is that you are trying to do. ASCII-Doc, Textile, and many other lesser-known formats. The other benefit is the speed improvements that you get. You're not waiting on the server's CPU to generate the page on each request, and so you have much faster response times from the server. There's no reverse proxying from Apache or Nginx to your application server, and web servers are made, ones like Nginx in particular, are made for serving static assets as fast as possible. Reliability is also a very key difference. Because there's no app server and there's no database server, there are just less moving parts, less things to go wrong, and you generally can upload your assets, and as long as Apache or Nginx are running, you never have to worry about your site being down. And you also have more control. The source content is on your machine. When you're using a CMS, you're making your changes on the remote server, and all of that data is there. So you have to be very careful about backups and making sure that that content that primarily only lives on your server is somehow archived, backed up. In this environment, your source content is right here. It's on your machine at all times. You just have more control over your own data. Deployment is also much easier. You can use rsync, GitHub pages, S3, CloudFront, Rackspace, Heroku. There's all kinds of different ways of deploying. You're not limited to a more limited set of choices. So, Pelican is one of many static site generators. It's the most popular Python static site generator by most measures, and has been around for a few years. There are nearly 250 contributors, and I think that number might be higher now. And it's a thriving ecosystem with plugins and themes and lots of interesting things. So I went out and just for fun, I found a few sites that are using Pelican here in Japan. And there are actually quite a few. And it's interesting to see the different creations that people have come up with to, I love the fact that people use this tool to talk about what they're passionate about. It doesn't matter if it's technology or something else. They're using this tool to publish their thoughts and their opinions and the things that they've learned, and I think that's really special. This actually is an interesting site in particular. This gentleman went and translated the entire set of Pelican documentation into Japanese. He hasn't had time to formally issue a pull request, but eventually, hopefully, that will happen. But in the meantime, you can go to his site, and as you can see, this is part 22, so he's done a lot of work. But Pelican is one of many static site generators. There are probably 400 or so that are listed on this one particular site, so choose the one that makes sense for you. So when are static site generators not a good fit? If you have a very data-heavy site, if, for example, you need to be able to say, I want to see all the t-shirts in blue, it's probably not a good solution. It's more for, it's more for content-driven sites. You have limited interactivity. So contact forms, things where you need some type of user interaction and feedback, that's generally not a great fit for static site generators. For some people, in some situations, the extra generation step can be a problem for some workflows. So if you have a site with thousands and thousands of pages and you want to be able to generate review quickly, that's going to be hard because the generation time will take, depending on the site, 30 seconds if you have, say, 3,000 pages. But there are ways of fixing that. And the user experience is also a factor. It's not nearly as approachable or user-friendly as WordPress or another CMS where you can log in and make your changes. But some of those rough edges, some of those problems are being addressed. Caching can be used on the generation side. So even if you have 3,000 pages, you can only generate the ones that have changed. And this is complicated to do, but we've made some early improvements to that. And so far, it looks like it has a very significant impact on generation speed. And there's also some web-based editing and live page reloading that's also been implemented by some other folks. Microservices can also help to ameliorate, to solve some of those problems. Self-hosted comments, site search, and contact forms are things that usually would be difficult, but by using a microservice, you can get that functionality. Michael Lustfield created a plugin for Pelican that allows you to search your site. It uses JavaScript and some indexing so that you can do that even without an application server on the back end. Another gentleman wrote a web-based editor so that you can review your pages and make your changes even if you don't interact with a terminal on a daily basis. And this is another web-based editor that someone wrote called Pelicide, also in its very early stages, but a promising project nonetheless. You can use microservices. So for example, like you could use either a JavaScript include, or you can use a simple one file Flask or bottle application to listen to the request, to use JavaScript to call that simple application and pass along something like an email address or a contact form without having to deploy a full-blown stack like Django or something more complicated. So that's also a useful way of doing that. But there's still a lot more left to be done. It should be more user-friendly than it currently is, and it would be interesting to hear about your experiences here in Japan. with how you publish things on the web. So, if you would like to contribute, by all means, please go to the Pelican site and take a look at the very long list of issues and pull requests. It's much longer than I would like, but it is a volunteer project, so it's certainly could use all the help that that we can get. So in summary, it's static site generators are increasing in popularity because they are simple, they're reliable, they're fast, they pair well with microservices, and you have more control over your software and your data, and ultimately, the stability and uptime of the content that you're trying to publish. So, given that we have a little bit of extra time, I'm going to do what you're not supposed to do, and just do a little bit of a live demo here and see what happens. We all know that the answer is it goes horribly, horribly wrong, but nonetheless, we're gonna experiment and see what happens. So, I'm using a different shell than most people. I use fish, so if you're wondering why it looks different, that's why. So let's see. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm creating a virtual environment, and then I'm going to install a few things. So I'm installing, I don't know, sorry it's a little small, but I'm installing Pelican, Markdown, Typography, which is a library for typographical enhancements, and an automation tool called Fabric. So it's going to go ahead and install all of those things. Thanks to Pelican Wheels, it now installs really, really fast, which is great. And once we have our stuff, then we can run a very simple quick start tool. And it's going to ask a series of questions. So I'm going to call this, let's see. Give me 1 second here while I. There we go. All right, so we're going to call this, there we go. And so I'm just going to answer some of these questions. English, and we're going to say no, and then we can just default answers for the rest. So what that has done is that has created a sample project, which I'm now going to go to. And I'm obviously not going to go through the process of writing an article from scratch, because that would take a long time. So I'm going to just take this pre-written article and put that in there, and there's a couple of tweaks to the settings file that I made. And I have an image in there, and then there's a theme that I'm also using that's a little different than the default. So once we have our content in there, we can run the Pelican command, and because it has some reasonable defaults, I don't have to add any extra command line switches. I can just run Pelican, and that generates the site. And then I'm going to go to, there we go. Let's see if this works. All right, no. Yeah, why not? We'll have two browsers open at once, why not? And there we are. There's our site. And this is the article. So as you can see, it's the response time is very fast. Well, it's locally, so it should be. But yeah, it's a fairly simple tool. It's something that you don't have to be an expert to do this. It requires a little bit of familiarity with the command line, but it's certainly not nearly as complicated as a modern WordPress console. The last time I logged into a WordPress console, it looked like an airplane cockpit. Just so many switches and knobs. So in many ways, I find it simpler. So you should give it a try. So yeah, that's the live demo. I would love it if you guys have some questions, and be happy to answer anything that you might have.
Okay, so any questions?
You mentioned at the beginning that there's lots sites like the Linux kernel archive and Debian that migrated to Pelican. They didn't start with it. Is there some documentation nowadays for people who want to migrate from another system, or is it still everybody figures it out on their own in general?
So the question was about migration, and how. So for the example of the Linux kernel and how they migrated from, to be honest, don't recall what they were using before, but if you're a site like that and you're trying to migrate, what tools are at, what tools can be used to do that migration. So Pelican comes with an importer, and I'm trying to remember. This particular portion of the project is not one that I use very often, as you can imagine, because I use Pelican. I'm not migrating other projects, but I know that there is a WordPress importer that is built in. There is an import from RSS. So if you have a site that isn't supported, you can, in theory, point to a RSS feed, and it can grab the structured data from the XML and pull in some of that information. It's not perfect, but it works. There was a few others, Posterous. I don't recall some of the other ones, but it's in the Get Pelican organization. There's a tool called Pelican. Actually, I think it might still be part of the Pelican project. We're talking about migrating it to a separate repository, but as it is now, I think it's part of Pelican. So have a look at it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Me and my friend was actually looking into using a static site generator, but the issue was it was kind of difficult for find a nice solution for have the site generated run by a community, like a group of people. Do you have any advice on how a static site generator would work amongst multiple people?
That's a great question, and I think I probably glossed over something rather important, and that's that one of the reasons, and I'll answer your question in just a moment, but one of the things that I really like about using a static site generator is you have flat files as your content. I won't pull it up just because it'll take a moment, but if you look at the content of the file, it's just a bunch of text at the bottom, and then at the top, there are a few fields, title, date, URL slug, and that's just your metadata, and then the rest of it is just the content. But so this entire series of files can be versioned, and that's something that's a little more complicated when you're dealing with a CMS, depending on which one you're using. So the answer to that question, from my perspective, is to use repositories. You can have, obviously you can have authorization and access control on the repository itself. And you can say okay, this person has access, this person, doesn't. And when if you make a mistake, it's easy to revert back to a previous version. And it's also a good idea, just as a side note, to version your output as well. Most people version your content. So they'll take your the posts and articles and other pages, and they will put those files into version control. But I recommend versioning the output as well, because if you make a change to your theme or something upstream, say Pelican makes a change that affects how your site appears on the output, if you haven't saved your output somewhere, it can be a little more challenging to get that back. So that's always a good idea as well. And I know that using Git or Mercurial or other tools can be difficult, but the good news is that there are more and more tools for, for version control that are not so complicated, and I think those could be helpful.
Thank you.
Is there any CMS or your recommendation to work well with this Perican?
So I think the question is, are there any CMSs that I would recommend to work with static sites?
That's my question.
Sure. Well, obviously, I think Pelican is a wonderful static site generator, but I'm biased. But there's a couple of other interesting projects. There's that aren't strictly static site generators. I mean, they are, but it depends on one's definition. But you can actually use Django and Flask to output static files as well. There's a couple of different projects. I don't recall the names of them. But someone who's already familiar with say, Flask or Django can use, I think one of them is called Flat Pages. I think is the Flask one is called Flat Pages. But there's several things like that where you can have a little bit more, let's say that you are very familiar with Django templates, but less familiar with Jinja templates. Then you can use the power of the Django template system and your familiarity with it to produce the same type of static output as you would with a dedicated static site generator. So that's one way of doing that.
Okay, any question? Okay, nothing? Okay.
Could you make some comment about the difference between Perican and Stinks?
That is an excellent question that I am ill-equipped to answer. I have spent time with Sphinx to the extent that we use it to generate the Pelican documentation. So I have run it. It operates on our restructured text documentation, and it generates the very nice looking docs that you can find on Read the Docs, which Eric has done a great job with. And but as far as comparing what Sphinx can do to Pelican, I think that Sphinx, it depends on what you want to do. If your goal is to build documentation, I think Sphinx is going to be a better choice. If your goal is to publish a more general purpose site where you have pages, you might have what I call chronological content, what other people would call blog posts. Then I think that Pelican or a static site generator is a better choice for that type of workflow. So it's mostly driven by what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you. That's great for me.
So I got a question about theme that you mentioned. So I have a corporate site running and it's static page, so I have to change even copyrights to 1.4 to 2.15 to every single page. So if I want to use that, but I'm still using a bootstraps and hand weaving, HTMLs and CSS tags, and how unique that theme format and structure is.
So at the end of the day, it's really just Jinja templates. It's not a whole lot more complicated than that. The theme is a collection of Jinja templates, some CSS, any JavaScript that you want to include, and any images that are part of the theme. Like if you have like a GitHub icon or a Twitter icon or something like that. But that's really the only structured part of it. There are of course certain things in the templates that are special or recognized that makes it work with Pelican, and without those things, it doesn't really work because it's looking for certain variables that you can specify in your settings file, like the author's name, or the name of the site, or other things that you want to appear, dynamically across various parts. But really, there's a lot of flexibility because, if you decide, in the footer that I want, the footer to be divided into a left half and a right half, and I want to manage those as two separate Jinja templates, you can do that. You can really do it any different way you want. But if you're going to change the year, just use JavaScript. Just do a dynamic, year equals JavaScript thing so that you don't have to go in there and change it every year. That's all the time we have. Thank you very much for coming, and yeah, it was great to hear all of your questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the great presentation. We want to take the photo with all attendees, so please go to the conference hall before the right-wing talks.